chance to sort of get to know them. And when you're stuck in the car for 8 hours a day or however long you can down Washington, you get a chance to learn what the projects are doing. Check out his display on the laptop and over some interesting information from something else. So Clement studies genomics of honeybees at York University and heads the Pollinator Gardens Project, a horticultural society at Parkdale, Toronto. He's the author of How to Make a Pollinator Garden booklet, and he's a 2011 recipient of the Canadian Pollinator Advocate Award from the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. He offers a Pollinator Gardens blog to bring fresh news and viewpoints of pollinators and gardening to the public, and speaks extensively on this topic to gardening clubs, beekeeper groups, and landscape professionals. Please welcome Clement.
Thanks. So maybe we'll just press AG there. I also wonder, but I got a loud voice, so I think we'll be all right. There's a PowerPoint slide that
it's recording now. But I can't, I don't know your tripod.
So what are you trying to do?
I just have to just go back a little bit.
I just had to zoom in on the person.
Oh, okay, so I was trying to get also the slides. So that it would make sense what they were talking about.
I'd like to thank Victoria for the introduction and all of Pollination Guelph for letting me be here. If we click through the slide, I'm going backwards through my presentation because you've heard the phrase calls to Newcastle, and it turns out if you bring slides about monarchs to Pollination Guelph, you're doing about the same thing. And I have lots of slides about monarchs, so I thought I'd throw a few different slides in that I wouldn't normally put up. This is from the talk that I gave last week at Concordia, where I talked to a bunch of students from an environment and geography department about social issues in pollinator gardens. And they were very interested in some of those issues, and I came up, given that none of them had any scientific background, with a number of simple, easy to remember words. And I said that one of the things that was important was that the people who work in this had to have a lot of passion for the issue. Because of course there's not a lot of funding for it. This is at the NA, North American Pollinator Protection Campaign conference that Victoria mentioned, where Dr. Isabel Ramirez from Mexico and I from Canada received Pollinator Advocate Awards, and there was one from for the United States as well. Dr. Ramirez actually works with local people in the area of Mexico where those oyamel trees are, where the monarchs are. There is a lot of illegal logging there, and one of her research actually does a lot is try to find ways for those people to gain benefits from their forests so that they will have an incentive to prevent them from being cut. It isn't enough in Mexico to simply pass a law. You need to have local enforcement. So there's somebody who's working on one side of the issue. We can try the button here. Yes, no? One of the other things you need to do to reach the public, and I was glad to have an educator talk before me, is you need to put on all kinds of silly costumes. There's me in my whiskers and my garb talking to the ex-mayor of Toronto and the lieutenant governor about some topics. I find that to actually reach the public, it's good to have as many silly costumes as you can come up with, and short words. It's also good to reach out to the biggest group possible. I love coming to committed groups like this, but look at how many of us there are in a room. So last year, as an experiment, I built a garden with many people's help at Canada Blues. And we think we had about 15,000 people come through, but we got really tired of trying to count after the first 2,000 or so. So just an estimate. And so I think one of the things that all of us who work in this area should be doing is thinking about how do we get the word out. So that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the use of pollinator gardens, not just as a way of improving your life and the life of pollinators, but of teaching the public. And there, I'm done. I'm going backwards from my slides. I'm finished. So when I was in Concordia, forgot the top hat, but I had the rest of the costume. And so that you wouldn't be slighted, I left the rest of the costume at home, but I brought the top hat, which I can't wear for very long because it's so hot. But, you know, there we go. Practice what you preach. Be always as interesting as you can. So now I'd like to take the slides back to the very beginning of this. So that's being back. If you're okay doing that, I'll leave it to you. But I'll talk to you briefly about what my definition of a pollinator garden is. It's like way, really great. This talk is mostly oriented towards people in cities and suburbs because I'm in the Horticultural Society of Parkdale, Toronto. I work with people in downtown Toronto, and we have a lot of land that could be used. Many of them very disconnected from nature. If you put up a picture of a monarch, some of them wouldn't know what it is. So I find it very necessary to give people a handle on these issues in simple ways. The simplest way I've found is by using pollinator gardens. I'm a gardener, I work with gardeners, everyone loves to do gardens. It's a positive issue. If you work on the pesticides, other things like that, you're working on issues which have many conflicting viewpoints, it's pretty easy to promote this viewpoint because most people like flowers, they like butterflies, and when I talk about pollinators, I don't mention the flies. And so I will apologize to Steve Marshall, but you know what? If trying to persuade people to love flies or bats is hard, persuade them to love butterflies or hummingbirds is easy. Bees are in between, and we'll talk about that a little bit. A quick definition of what I call a pollinator garden is just my definition, and it's not a textbook or anything. It's a partial restoration of a native ecosystem. Partial because you can't do that much in a garden, but you can make steps to it. So you want to use native plants in it. It's not essential for the pollinators. Pollinators may get along quite well with non-native plants, but it's very easy to produce wonderful gardens using native plants, and I'll talk some of the reasons why you might do it. You'd like to make the garden to aid many species of native pollinators. Some people will see a talk on monarchs or a talk on hummingbirds, and they'll say, well, I should just have all of this kind. And what I try to get across is that there are a lot of different pollinators out there, and we should provide a variety of resources for them. As Kristen pointed out, we really want to educate the public about pollinators and plants. So that's one of the primary purposes of my gardens. People ask me, should I put it in my front yard or backyard? If you have a choice, put it in the front yard and be prepared to answer questions about it. And these are gardens, not full ecosystems. I'm not speaking to you as an ecosystem restoration specialist who have different points of view. So I sometimes do things that gardeners will do and that somebody from, say, the North American Native Plant Society might not do. So you can all boo and hiss when I talk about it. In order to boil this all down, as an academic I tend to use words that are too long. So when I was writing my little pamphlet about how to make a pollinator garden, I read the Toronto Star over and over again. And just as punishment, I read a little bit of the Toronto Sun, trying to get the length of my words and the vocabulary I use down to a level that wouldn't put people off. And then I read some children's books. Because my goal is not to persuade academics. If I only had to persuade Peter Kevin, my job would be done. So I tried to make a very simple approach so that it was like a cookbook, so that people can just sit down and go through these steps and have a pollinator garden. So I talk about the why, what, who, and where, and I'll go light on that because most of you already know many of those points. And then I have a particular 7-step plan for putting the garden together and maintaining it. Because we're short on time, I'm not going to go into great detail on some of these things. These are the 5 W's. So we're thinking kid-style thing here. So I feel a little bit like Mouse about the 5 W's in the sentence, but it is good to give people simple things to do. So this is the one where I normally spend lots of time talking about how pollinators are in trouble and how we can help and how essential they are. But you know all that, right? I see enough nods around here that I'll move on. was taken near my former home in Parkdale, at a time when it was in an elm grove. It was actually a street there named Elm Grove. And these people are proudly sawing and chopping down the largest elms in Toronto at the time to make room for the establishment of houses that was built on Elm Grove Street. So habitat loss is a big issue. The thing that I find people don't spend enough time thinking about is who will enjoy the garden. We do think about the pollinators, but let's make sure, Steve Marshall aside, that we know who the main ones are. First, we've got butterflies, we've got bees, and if Laura's back over here, you want me to do the whole talk on the bees, and we've got birds. I use the birds a lot, simply because it's a colorful, audible component to the story. I'm not slighting any of the pollinators. I'd like to see lots of flies there. If we had pollinating bats, I would love to know that. But the other thing you have to pay attention to are who are the humans. There are many different types of people who can use pollinator gardens, and when I design them for different places, I have to take that into account. Will it be people in wheelchairs doing it? Or will it be kids who are running all over it and through it? And what are you going to put in it? This is my daughter long ago sitting and looking at a big sunflower that I planted because it's big and gaudy and kids get into it. You can get lots of bees on it. You can't see there, but there's a bunch of bumblebees on it. And then in Toronto, you have to wonder about who are the other species going to come to your garden. Is your Labrador dog going to jump in the pond that you put there as a water supply? Are you going to get pleasant accidental visitors, or are you going to have others? One of the great things about reconnecting kids, city kids to nature, is just the pleasure they get out of it. This picture was taken on the shore of Lake Huron one day in the fall when a series of migrations got hit by a fall storm. I walked along the beach early in the morning, and there were all these damp butterflies lying on the beach. So I grabbed the kids, took them down to the beach, stuck butterflies all over their shirts, and brought them up into the sunshine. And the looks on their faces as their shirts began to turn into brilliant flapping clothing was quite an interesting thing to see. The when figure is about several different time scales you want to be aware of. Which seasons are you in the garden? You might plant a cottage garden, which is mostly for July and August. You might plant a garden in the city for when you're not at the cottage. Or you might be a school garden where you really want to have everything happen in spring and in fall. And so those affect a lot of it. You also have to ask what time of the day are you going to be there, and what time of the day are the pollinators going to be there. So what's one of the problems in Ontario that many of these pollinators face? Well, habitat loss is a good answer, but I'm going to go on the day time scale. The plants are sitting there, brewing up the nectar all night. It's morning, they're full of nectar, everybody's hungry, they eat breakfast.
The street lights.
No, I don't think it's streetlights. It's cold. For a good part of the Ontario morning in many months, it's too cold for most insects to fly. It doesn't inhibit a hummingbird that can shiver. It doesn't stop a bumblebee that can shiver. So as a result, they're often the two that are there first in the garden. And what temperature do honeybees maintain their nest at? Any guesses?
35 degrees.
Pretty close, yeah. I think it's between 34, 33, something like that. So almost human body temperature. So they very often, the honeybees will be the next thing out. But the butterflies won't get out there anywhere near as soon. So depending on whether you're sitting in your garden before going to work on a summer morning or late in the afternoon, you might get different pollinators coming in. When do you plant is illustrated by this one picture here. It's in Hyde Park. I sure wish we could darken the window a little bit, but there we are. As you can see by the red bud, we're planting in late April, early May, which is, I think, the easiest time to get any garden in the ground, and really is the time you should focus on doing it. Unfortunately, a lot of people will get excited by the spring pansies, that kind of thing. They'll start their planting process, and then it'll be mid-July or August and say, I'm ready to plant a garden. Oh dear. and how much time you have to water it. So I did try to make people aware of this basic gardening fact that even though once it's established, a native plant garden won't need a lot of water. It's just like anything else. If you're planting it in midsummer, you need to be aware of that. And when do you maintain? Not all my slides are coming up, funny enough. When you maintain was on the previous slide, and I had a picture for it. Many of our native bees and some other pollinators will be in things like hollow stalks. Some of the butterfly pupae will be underneath bark or logs, that kind of thing. I have a continual battle with people who are tidier than me because they tend to tidy their gardens to death, literally to death, because there are some species of pollinators where if you rake it down to the bare earth in the fall so that it looks neat, you're destroying all of the overwintering pollinators in there. So there's some attention you have to pay to how you maintain and when you maintain the pollinator garden. Finally, where will it go? You're going to put it in a public or a private space. For instance, when we put in this garden in Hyde Park in Toronto, the park staff told us, "Oh, don't bother labeling the plants because all the labels will get torn up and moved anyway." So just, provide some other sorts of information. The amount of sun or shade, obviously, that's a basic gardening question. Wet or dry soil is probably one of the key things most people don't think about. Again, it's a basic gardening question, but you have to fit the plant to the soil, especially if you don't want to do a lot of maintenance. And I always try to emphasize low, long-term maintenance. In cities, we have a lot of people who live in apartments with balconies. And so they ask me, can you do a pollinator garden in pots? Yes, you can. It's much harder. It's harder to make a perennial garden, and many of our best native plants are perennials, but it's not impossible. And if the slide will come up, no, it won't. All right, this is an example of our pollinator garden in Hyde Park 3 months after it was planted. So it can be close to an instant gratification, but it's a bit of work to get it that way. Practicalities are that there will always be visitors to your garden that you can't control and maybe didn't want to have. Hyde Park's a sterling example of that. Toronto, as you know, has got probably as many raccoons as it's got politicians, and it's a race between them which is worse behaved. So you have to think about things like that. So here's just an example. The gentleman watering his lawn on the left is Emma Zayed, a bee researcher at York University, who said, "Great, I've just moved into this suburban house, I have nothing but grass," and I said, "Okay, let's kill it." And so we went out and killed all of his grass by making a lasagna garden. What's a lasagna garden? Layers. Yeah, you put down sheets of newspaper over the grass and then a little bit of soil on top of that. Not rich soil. Please don't buy a lot of triple mix. Just buy sandy gravel mix. That's probably just fine. And then you plant your plants through it, and then you don't struggle with grass sometimes. And there's his garden a month or two later, and there it is at the end of the first summer. And he lives in a predominantly Italian area north of Toronto, and he gets frequent visits from people whose front yards are all grass saying, "How did you do that?" I want to do that. So it's easy to do, and generally meets with a positive response from your neighbors. In Hyde Park, we started off with bare land, starting with some larger milkweeds in pots. A few months later, we had sunflowers, September 15th. So it works pretty quickly. Here's my Coles Newcastle part. Kristen did speak about milkweed. I'm going to speak to you about them a little bit more in terms of what gardeners need to know about them. First of all, if this is a garden, don't plant the common milkweed in it, because it spreads by root runners and quickly takes over and puts you to lots of trouble controlling it. And since we have about 13 to 14 species of native milkweeds in Ontario, you have plenty of others to choose from. So you could start off the year with Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed, which blooms the end of June into July, depending on your site. It's a lower plant, not quite as tall as most of the rest. And it actually is quite beautiful in some of the prairie, moist to basic, I guess we would call it, prairie environments in the southwestern part of the state. You can see pictures of it down here in Windsor. What a gardener needs to know about this plant, it's a true Canadian. It's very skeptical about the weather. It doesn't put up its first shoots until well towards the end of May. And so you're thinking, oh, it died. And you start digging with the shovel and you're killing the plant. Oh, wait, this is one of those skeptical Canadian types of plants. The swamp milkweed was another one that Kristen put up, but it doesn't need a swamp. It will grow there, but it's happy in any normal soil as long as it doesn't get too dry. Now at the point where you figure out where the next people are, and I duck, because you can buy cultivars of this that have been bred for different colors. For instance, there's a white one, and there's some that are darker red. But I find that just by selecting individuals from the wild, I get pretty good variety in color forms. So this is a good bloomer, it's vigorous, and I can guarantee you that the monarchs do like it. Last talk, people asked, do monarchs have preferences? They do. If you plant several milkweeds side by side, you will find some of them fully occupied with monarch caterpillars and others with none. For instance, there's a little white milkweed that grows out of our cottage that never has any monarchs on it. One of the reasons is that some of them have more of these poisons than others, and they prefer to lay on the plants that have more of the poisons. So not all species are equally good. This is a less common one. This is the whorled milkweed, Sleepius verticillata. It's very drought tolerant and survives in poor sandy soils. It has almost pine needle-like leaves, little narrow leaves. So it's actually quite an attractive foliage plant when it's not blooming, and monarchs love it just as much as any of the others. And our Hyde Park garden is on a slope, it's sandy soil, and this plant does beautifully there. And now here again I have to duck. This is not a native. This is probably the plant or close to the plant that our monarchs evolved on. It's one that their cousins in Costa Rica and still eat, and it's one that the first generation that lays in Texas probably grow up on. This is a Sleepius cursata. And it's an absolutely beautiful plant that can be grown from seed just like zinnias. So start the season indoor a bit early, plant in a bright sunny spot. And unlike most of the other milkweeds, it will bloom continuously once it reaches a certain size until the frost cuts it down. It's extremely attractive to monarchs. If you put this next to other milkweeds, almost all of the ones will be laid on this. I don't encourage people to plant this too much if they want a very native plant garden. But say you're dealing with parks people, or say you're dealing with a children's garden, where you need to have flowers in September. This is a wonderful and easy plant to use. So there are circumstances under which I would recommend using this. And I don't worry about it becoming invasive because it has absolutely no tolerance for frost. So I won't talk about this because it's been well covered in our previous talk, but what I will hark back to, at the beginning I talked about all those one-letter words that I told the kids at the Concordia. And one of the words that I won't show you the slide for was pirates. But I was so happy to have been preceded by a pirate because Kristen is a lawbreaker, as are many of us. There is a very obscure Ontario law that says thou shalt not handle monarchs because they have been decreed a species at risk and you require a permit from the Ontario government. So if I, as an academic, were to counsel you to move monarch caterpillars into boxes or something like that, I would be breaking the law. Whether I approve of the law is something we can talk about later, but if you were trying to do something with school groups or with an organization that might be exposed to public blame if it was caught, you might consider asking the ministry for a permit or working with a local group. For instance, in Toronto, there's a group called the Toronto Entomologists Association that actually works all over southern Ontario that gets a blanket permit for its members. So if you really have to put on a large project for kids, consider whether you want to do that. It's a nuisance. And then we have our obligatory pictures, which we will skip through. Oops. And if this works, perhaps you can just click once. This is done not in Mexico, and as you will see, not by a professional photographer, but by me with my handheld camera. One of the interesting things about Ontario, one of the reasons the Iroquois were able to do the work they did in discovering the monarch, is that we're on monarch flyways wherever the Great Lakes exist. So our cottage is out on the shore of Lake Huron, and the monarchs tend to concentrate when they meet a water body and fly along its edges until they can pass over. So one morning in late August, I went out. It was a windy day, so the monarchs were not flying south as fast as they could. They were all clustered there, waiting for the wind to be over. And I had probably grown a few hundred of them in the small suburban-sized plot I have out there, where I have 5 milkweed species, but most of these, I suspect, came from elsewhere. So you don't have to go all the way to Mexico to see conglomerations of monarchs. I don't have good pictures, but I did see several thousand in a cluster of cedars one day in Ontario. So for those of you who are out and about in late August and early September, look for a day when the wind is blowing from the south, and then go to sheltered coves along the coast of any of the Great Lakes and look for monarchs, and you may find them. All right, we'll click that and see if I can move forward. Okay. Sorry? Yeah. So here's a different plant. Everybody knows about this, right? You can all tell me the name. This is bee balm, which is called Monarda. There's actually 2 species of it. We can argue about whether both species are native to Ontario, and there are lots of garden hybrids. But it's a way to get a grand variety of other things. And what do you do if you want the longest bloom from your bee balm? Yeah, I see the snipper's face up there. This is a plant that comes up and blooms beautifully in July and early August. And then it goes to seed. But if you cut off the top flower heads around that time, it will bring out new sets of flowers, and it will keep the bloom going into the fall. It's perennial. It is aggressive. It's a member of the mint family, you know what that means. But fortunately, all the roots are just on the surface, so when it goes where you don't want it, it's very easy to rip out and give to your neighbors. And you can get almost any kind of pollinator on it. In all these pictures I take, you just sit in the garden near a patch of bee balm, and the most amazing things come by. Can you see the pollinator in the middle of this? It's a hummingbird sphinx moth. And you know, at first I thought I was hearing a hummingbird, but when I tracked it down, I could see what that was. So bee balm, very easy to grow, perennial, long-lived. It does like to move around a bit in the garden, so don't try and keep it in the same spot forever, because there seem to be some bacterial diseases. There are many other plants. In a little book on pollinator gardening, I have a list of plants appropriate to Ontario, especially southern Ontario. So I won't try to tell you all about them, but I will say try and plant plants with smaller flowers as well. You don't just want the big pollinators. These are very tiny individual florets, and you attract a whole different range of pollinators to the tiny flowers, as you can see. And research on pollinator gardens in cities finds that factor number 1 is sun. People come to me, very well meaning, say, I want to put in a garden here, and I say, well, how much sun I get? We might get an hour. And I say, maybe find a different location. Because it is very hard to get enough continuous bloom, and the pollinators themselves are oriented towards sunny patches. So the second factor, the amount of flowers. It's as simple as If you can get a sunny spot with a continuous supply of flowers, you'll have pollinators. This area I'm going to leave to afternoon workshops, but continuing care in the garden, particularly if it's a public garden, is one of the most crucial aspects of the pollinator garden. You have to have a plan for keeping the thistles out. It's all very nice to say that a native plant garden doesn't need much care, but thistle seeds will blow in. Objectionable plants will grow in. There's a really unfortunate example in eastern Toronto where people did plant a naturalized area, which was then invaded by things like thistles and other plants, and the neighbors got in an uproar because they said it's an unsightly weed patch. And so your wonderful pollinator garden plan can be completely overturned if you don't have a continuing weeding plan. It's not too much work, but you have to do something. And with that, I should probably come to a close and take your questions. This is why we're trying to do pollinator garden awareness. In the western mountain valleys of China, there's an area famous with apples. And they like to sell these big apples to people in Beijing, so they drench the entire valley in pesticides. As a result, they have no pollinators. So every spring, they put on their colorful native garb, take out their camels, hair brushes, mount ladders, and go up and move pollen from one tree to another. So that's how the world will be if we don't make some efforts. So with that, I think I'll stop and ask for questions. No questions?
Probably anticipating us to meet really this afternoon. So, thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm just curious, what are the plant height bylaws in Clement?
Oh, they're ridiculous and difficult. And there are many stories of people being told to take down their front gardens. It seems to be a question of thinking about the aesthetics of it. You can use the same plants if you clip and trim around them a little bit to give it a tender look. If you let them go in a wild look, which is what I prefer, then some of your neighbors, and I won't use the words that I regularly use, may end up complaining. So it's an aesthetic issue. No one calls the bylaw enforcement officer if they think it's pretty. Yes.
Yeah, do you have any words to give us on the certification of pollinator-friendly gardens, and that's starting to become, I mean, it started in California, but it's now being embraced by certain organizations like Seeds and Diversity in Canada?
I have words to say, which are that I have to deal with all kinds of bureaucracy all the time in my job with the Horticultural Societies of Parkdale, Toronto. I hear about things like what happened to Pollination Guelph and the landfill site. I think certification can be a positive under some circumstances, but if I ask people to put the same amount of energy into making a second pollinator garden rather than certifying the first, I think it's a worthy topic of discussion, but I'm not fully in favor of it. Yes?
You talk about pollinator gardens and plants. What about trees and shaded areas?
In the booklet, I talk about all the trees that bloom, which provide massive amounts of forage in the springtime especially, when they bloom. One of the very best things you can do if you have a large property is a hedge of pussy willows at the back, because that provides forage first thing in the spring abundantly. There's tons of things you can do that.
We had started in our community, City Park started a recognition, and now they've gone and started recognizing native plant gardens too. So they're trying to get even their members, who a lot of them have moved away from the traditional into the native, and trying to get them in people's way. And I just wondered, for me, I think the certification is more difficult process, and this
the most creative arrangements don't get awards, because the judges have their rules. And the same thing goes with gardens out in the community. There are many community garden, go around and nominate your neighbor's garden for a prize. It's rarely the most interesting gardens that win because we have a very limited garden aesthetic in North America, and ones that look more natural and that don't feature large sprayed roses tend not to win. So until we can change that aesthetic, I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. Yes?
I have a front piece that's sort of wild, and I'd like to make it more pollinator friendly, but I'd like to have some signs that I could put in, because lots of people walk by there, to say, can you see?
Yeah, I
Does
think,
somebody produce signs that you could change in your garden? And
not that I'm aware of, but it's an excellent opportunity. I think that these days you can get the sign printed and laminated. And since I know that Pollination Guelph has excellent photos of pollinators on plants, it should be easy for somebody to put together something on a computer and find a local printer who's willing to produce a printed laminated version of that.
Maybe Pollinator Guelph can put together a series that we can print at home and then laminate.
It's good to keep it cheap because little boys love to tear things down. And so, rather than investing in the big bronze plaque that costs $150, I encourage people to think of the $10 alternative.
Last question.
I had made a suggestion to the cultural group at one point that there should be a special prize for the most beautifully chewed rose leaves by Megachilid bees. It was not well accepted.
I heard you say that in a garden party at Lawrence Thatcher's house, and I had stolen your phrase and reused it over and over and over again. Because we need to teach people that the aesthetic of nature is to preserve and protect nature, and not to worry and spray the moment you see some holes in your face. And Peter gets the first dibs award on coming up with this wonderful idea. We need a method that ties into the need for recognition and approval that a number of people have brought up, whether it's certification, whether it's awards, or something else that teaches people that other ways of appearing are good, are beautiful, and I'm still trying to find those, because I find many gardeners are very conservative in what they like. They want it to look like say a French manicured parterre, and that's not always the best.